Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vierra, part of the outreach team of Silver Bullion here in Singapore, where we want to help you truly secure your wealth. Today, I'm with the founder of Silver Bullion, or the Silver Bullion Group, for that matter, Gregor Gregersen, and as you can see, we are in a different environment. Gregor, would you like to tell them where we are today?
Yes, so this is the first time that we are recording something from the studio inside the reserve. So we are on the 5th floor, overlooking behind us into the main silver vault, where we can store up to 10,000 tons of silver. So we are doing the recording in this direction because there's too much glare if you're looking down into the main silver vault, which was something we realized just now. But we are still having a fantastic view from here.
Yeah, the glare, it's, I went overboard with getting too many lights for the studio, and we kind of got too much glare. And I also apologize for that, but we'll be sure to let you see all the different angles from here. But Gregor, first thing I'd like to ask you, it's been in the news for a while now, a few days. We have these tariffs going on, these 100% tariffs on BRICS nations that choose to use something outside of the US dollar. Your opinion, how do you see this unfolding?
Yeah, so the tariffs has been part of a bigger trend, I think, for decades now. And I think this latest comment by Trump said there will be 100% tariffs on countries that are not using the US dollars. It's just something that's very directed, and I think it's the kind of thing which makes people shy away from the US dollar. It really is causing, countries to look elsewhere. And I think that is, a concerning sort of direction we are looking at, because I see things happening pretty fast now. And, as part of this, I'd like to share a currency war scenario, which I've been sharing with a number of different entities over the last year or two. And essentially, the fear is that with what's happening right now, the United States is putting sanctions on specific industries, prohibiting them from sending chips, manufacturing devices, for example, to China. Some Dutch companies really are the most important players here, and the US is saying you're not allowed to sell to the Chinese. There are over 140 companies involved which are being prohibited. So China, of course, resents that. Then you have the United States, which essentially sanctioned many Chinese champions. Huawei, all right, is a very powerful company which has essentially been banned from much of the West, very targeted by the United States. And then you have the broad spectrum tariffs, whether it's going to be 35%, whether it's going to be 100%, whether it's on EVs, whether it's on solar panels, and all these other things. And the concern is that we're going from a world where it was possible to trade, and it created a time when there was peace, and it really reinforced the US dollar in many ways, to a new world where trade is being made more and more difficult. And from a Chinese perspective, the more tariffs you put on them, the less effective they become, because at some point, the pain of retaliation just is becoming small enough to do it. When your tariffs are 100%, you might as well not trade. So I might as well do something back to you. And, that's one of the issues I see happening. And we have to understand, China has been, for several years now, for many years, been diversifying out of the US dollars. So if you look at Chinese US dollar holdings, last statistic I saw was 772 billion US dollars. That's down about 23% over the last 2 years. So Chinese are letting their treasuries mostly expire, so they're not buying new ones. And that's reducing the connections they have to the US dollars. If we were to get to a point where China is going to retaliate, they don't want to have a lot of exposure to US dollars, because the US dollar falls, then their holdings will fall. So they're switching into something else. And that something else are mostly real assets. And gold, of course, plays one huge part in that. There are two things which many listeners might not be aware, but China spot prices of gold are higher than in the West. They have been like this for a long time. And that basically means that companies that import gold from outside China into China and then sell it locally can make a free arbitrage profit. And it's just that you have to be one of the Shanghai Gold Exchange approved importers in order to do that. So about 18 companies or banks which are allowed to do it. And I know that these banks are basically shipping a lot of physical gold into China. And this physical gold is gold which is over the counter, meaning it is not going through future contracts or financial markets in that sense, which means it doesn't affect the price of gold. So China has been accumulating these large amounts of gold, well in excess of what's officially reported, as they prepare for something. The second thing to understand is China is like a black hole. So gold goes in and it doesn't come out. Now, you might be aware that China has quite a bit of jewelry exports. So how does that work? Well, there's a rule in China that you can have no net exports of gold. And so if you are a jewelry manufacturer, or if you're outside of China and you want to have some jewelry being produced in China, because they do it very cheaply, then you would have to bring in, let's say, 50 kilos of gold has to go in, and 50 kilos of gold is going to come out in the form of jewelry. But there can be no net export. And so between China essentially keeping the price of gold at higher than the West and not allowing for net exports to go out, they've basically been soaking up a lot of gold, and a lot of that gold has not really been affecting prices because it is not going through the Tokyo Gold Exchange, it is not going through COMEX, it's not going through any of these future exchanges that set the spot price of gold. And this has been an ongoing trend. But if you look at it at the bigger picture, what does that mean? It means that China is reducing its cost of retaliation. And as more tariffs are coming, the more likely this becomes that at some point China is going to retaliate. Now, today they announced that germanium and a few other metals are not going to be exported directly, and some of these metals are going up in value, but that's really minor stuff, right? The thing which I think we have to worry about as far as global stability is concerned is a scenario whereby China were to start dumping US dollars. Again, they have $772 billion. And at the same time, prohibit Chinese companies from accepting US dollars. Because if that happens, all trading partners with China, and of course China is huge, right, in terms of trade, would then have to sell the US dollars in order to buy something else with which to perform trade. And given the amount of fiscal deficit in the United States, the amount of debt, and all these other factors, this could essentially push the US dollar into a very weak position because the US dollar is only based on the trust people have in it. So that can become very dangerous. And if such a scenario were to happen, I would assume the United States will consider it a financial attack. And what would probably happen is that the US might just sanction every company which doesn't accept US dollars. And if that were to happen, then you have a split financial system and you would have a stop of trade. Because why would I ship you some goods if I have no idea how I'm going to be paid? Because the bank won't allow the transfer. The US only wants to pay in US dollars, and Chinese companies or other companies don't want to accept US dollars. How do you get around this? And more importantly, what do you do if you're a bank? Because the thing to understand with banks is regardless where you are, as long as you invest on SWIFT managed banking system, you're subject to US laws and US sanctions. And local countries might very well resent that. If we look back at what happened with Hong Kong, the United States put sanctions on Carrie Lam. Carrie Lam was the CEO of Hong Kong, which basically means the president of Hong Kong, right? And HSBC, H stands for Hong Kong, Shanghai Banking Corporation. That's what HSBC stands for. So they had to close the bank account of Carrie Lam, or face billions of dollars in fines from the US. But it's kind of like, imagine a foreign power telling Bank of America that they have to close the bank account of the US president and of vice president and a few other people. It doesn't matter what the political reasons are behind it. It is an intrusion, in sovereignty, and countries resent that. So there's going to be a drive to moving towards something else. And if you then add tariffs and you're adding other things and other things and other things, at some point things are going to break.
Right.
How is it going to break? Well, the example with the dumping of US dollars and refusing to accept US dollars, can be such a situation. And if you're a bank in such a situation, you're between a rock and a hard place. Are you going to deal with Chinese companies and leave the US-based system, or are you going to stay with US-based system, not deal with any Chinese companies? Mm-hmm. And what about Brazilian companies which are part of BRICS? What are they going to do? Right? So you might be facing a situation where trade is largely coming to a halt, where payments cannot be done, and unless you restart trade in some way, there's a large chance that you end up with a hot war next. Because trade is usually what allows countries to be dependent on each other. And it's good that countries are dependent with each other to some degree, because it reduces the likelihood of war. So that is the scenario, and these scenarios has been played out in the Pentagon many times. There's a book out there called Currency Wars by Jim Richards. Mm-hmm. It's a very fascinating book. He was playing China in the Pentagon war games, and they were facing a similar scenario, and the way he restarted world trade was to say, we're going to place all of our gold in Switzerland, in this case, and any trade has to go through Switzerland, and we're going to net out gold balances held in the neutral jurisdiction. Now, whether it's Switzerland or some other jurisdiction, it doesn't matter so much. What matters is it has to be a jurisdiction that both the West and the East can trust, mm-hmm. in terms of the countries involved that don't trust each other to trade normally. And the assets that's being held has to be apolitical. Gold is going to be the choice. Right now, central banks had about 7% of the assets in gold a few years ago. They've been acquiring a lot more gold. They're around 11% now, I believe, based on the World Council numbers. And that is probably going to increase more. Mm-hmm. And if such a situation comes, it is very likely that countries will choose to settle things between gold as a short-term alternative to get things starting again. Give the system to kind of come back to its senses and come up with a way of trading. And that's essentially where a place like Singapore makes a lot of sense, because being a mediator between these countries, will have that position. But that's essentially the fear that is coming up, because such a currency war scenario is becoming more likely. And everybody has been speaking with, which might have thought that was a nutcase scenario, is no longer thinking so. And that's where the announcement of Trump about 100% tariffs on countries not using the US dollar is actually pushing countries in that direction, and that's a very worrisome trend.
Great points there, because when you get back to James Ricker's books, Currency Wars, The Death of Money, I think those are two very good books to really get into and understand. The interesting part here when talking about these tariffs potentially coming up, is the U.S. actually in a position to call this ultimatum on other countries?
Are you with us or against us, basically?
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, some countries naturally sort of align in a sense, but I think every country is having a bit of a stomachache about it. Especially, I mean, if you're going to put sanctions against one country you don't trade much with, yeah, okay, we go along. If you're going to ask, a country to give up its relationship with a huge trading partners that you rely on, well, you become a bit more suspicious and say, hey, can't we just all be friends? You have a quarrel with that country, why don't you settle it? Don't ask me to half destroy my economy because you have a quarrel with that country, right? So at that point, I think it becomes a matter of influence. When I moved to the United States in '93, and I went to high school there, I remember my political class, there was this concept of the United States talking softly but carrying a big stick. And that was an excellent policy. It's worked for many, many, many decades. It made the US into a very powerful country. And that policy basically said, don't ask for crazy things, be reasonable, but make sure you have a big stick, because if you ask for something reasonable, you can whack somebody on the head with your army or your financial system or your social, your soft power. So people are kind of going to be reasonable to you too. But if you start asking for unreasonable things and you start shouting and your stick becomes smaller, right, then you risk losing that respect. You risk losing that likelihood that other countries will sort of work with you. And if those countries don't see it as reasonable, they will come up with counter proposals that they see reasonable. And if you're not in a mood of finding a middle way, you are risking irrelevance, because the United States cannot fight the rest of the world. The United States has to work with other countries as well. And if you become too one-sided, these countries will just sort of trade with you less. And, it's not a black and white. It's always going to be a gradual sort of thing.
Yeah, because I think this ultimatum, that I'll choose to call it, yes, it is going to drive countries to look for dollar alternatives at that point, having a plan B, so to speak. But for the people out there, they are still in sovereign currencies, whether it's a US dollar, whether it may be a British pound, whatever it may be, we are still tied into currencies. If the banks are already creating gold reserve assets, shouldn't we be really considering this ourselves?
Well, I think owning gold and silver, that's why we are here. But, coming back to the people, I mean, there's an interesting example when Russia invaded Ukraine and sanctions were first put into Russia. What happened to Russian tourists? And I can give you an example. I mean, in Turkey, right, Russian tourists which were using Visa cards and MasterCards, they were stranded. Your card stopped working. So, I mean, look at it from that perspective. I mean, they're just being tourists in a place. Suddenly your country does something and your card doesn't work anymore and your assets are being locked down. It's not your personal fault, but the people who had Union Pay, it kept on working. So what lessons do people take out of this? Not just the Russians, but everybody else. Well, it's a good idea to have a Union card.
Yeah.
Union Pay card. And Union Pay card, for those who don't know, is essentially a credit card, a payment system based on a Chinese standard. And it is now bigger than MasterCard and bigger than Visa. It is the largest payment system worldwide. And I forgot, but they have over, I think, a quarter. I checked 6 years ago, it was over a 250,000 ATMs around the world with the system. So it's just telling countries, maybe, or people, maybe have a Union card as a backup. I think it's in everybody's interest, to have options. U.S. citizens as well. It does make sense to have options, and unfortunately, once your payment systems are becoming too political, and you feel like the money that you have maybe isn't really yours, which is something we can talk about later as well, then it makes sense to diversify your risk and have some other alternatives. And if some people in the United States are starting to do it, well, of course, people in other countries are definitely doing that as well. So this process is moving on, and the more we have these messages that you take the US dollars, or we are going to do this and this, the more it is driving people towards doing exactly what you don't want them to do.
Right, because I think also in this, let's say this tariffs and currency wars type of a scenario, there could also be the probability of nationalization. The mining companies already mentioned how when it comes to resources, governments may be looking at nationalizing a nation's resources. But how about people's assets? We saw what happened in 1933 with the U.S. nationalizing gold, basically making it illegal. You see this type of thing possibly unfolding again?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that a country is dependent on having a viable currency. And a country will do anything to maintain its ability to pay its army, its police, its pension, and everything else. If the US dollar is not worth anything, the US government would have no power. Right? So that's the first thing to understand. The second basic thing is that the US dollar is only based on trust. It's no longer backed by gold. So you have to maintain a certain level of trust for people to have the power. If you lose the trust in the currency, the whole thing kind of breaks. And that's really the most worrisome point, because politicians seem to have forgotten that part. So they're saying, use this, and it's not a trust-building exercise. People do have choices. And if they decide to move somewhere else, then this can break down. So if you go into a scenario where we have a currency war, the US dollar is being dumped both by, let's say, BRIC countries and companies that don't accept it anymore, right? Then that can cause a quick fall into the value of the US dollar, which then can become a self-reinforcing process. And if that happens, it's throughout history, governments have looked at finding something else to back the currency. That's what Germany and Weimar Republic during hyperinflation, 1923, they had to go back to a gold standard ultimately to build trust in the currency again. And if that happens, you have to ask yourself, will the United States nationalize gold again? Well, of course, right? I mean, if that's the expedient thing to do, then you will do that. And the next question is, well, which gold can be nationalized? And I think the answer would be clearly all gold within US jurisdiction. And what is US jurisdiction?
Yeah,
well,
point.
So it's gold which is stored, let's say, in Singapore under US jurisdiction. Well, Singapore is its own jurisdiction, but who's holding that gold? Because if the company holding that gold is a US company, then yes, that gold is under US jurisdiction because it is held by an entity which is subject to US law. It's like a chain, right? It's like a counterparty chain. You're only as safe as the weakest link of that chain. So it doesn't matter if you move your gold to Singapore, or if you moved it to Frankfurt, or you're keeping it in Dallas, or you're keeping it in Vancouver. If you're keeping it with a company which is subject to US law, it doesn't matter where it is. If there's a message or a request from US authorities, US Treasury, that the gold has to be nationalized, it has to be sent back to the US, and the vault is going to get a certain amount of dollars, and these dollars are going to compensate people for this, just like happened in 1933. Then the question becomes, is that vault going to follow the law of the US, or is it not going to follow that law?
Right.
And so you will find that most large global operating vaults already have force majeure clauses in their contracts, which essentially states that if the assets being held on your behalf are going to be subject to seizure, nationalization, or confiscation by any country, you have to indemnify the vault operator. So legally, these companies already set themselves up, to sort of foresee the eventuality of that. And that's where, we've been quite different, because from the start, we set up the company to only have Singapore jurisdiction and only be subject to Singapore law, so that, we are foreseeing this kind of scenario. But I suspect that, when such a nationalization happens, you will find all the gold held in these big ETFs, in all the savings accounts, most of the gold held with the big global vaulting operators. It will just all flow back to the United States and going to be nationalized. And that's probably going to happen even before it is officially announced. Mm-hmm. So by the time you're aware of it, the gold is already gone. And if you look back at Executive Orders 6102 from 1933, that was when the basis on which gold was nationalized. And it was something that was decided by the US president as an executive order. It did not have to go through Congress. It was announced on April 5th, 1933, and by May 1st, you had to turn in your gold. The US government was going to nationalize that gold at $20.67 per ounce. And then it was essentially, the price was increased to $35 per US dollar, which basically means the US dollar was devalued by that amount of money. So in this case, it's not a matter of devaluing the US dollar, it's a matter of having a currency which people can trust if people lose faith in the United States dollar. And that's the scenario whereby if we go into a currency war and it threatens the credibility of the US dollar, a nationalization is very likely to happen. And that nationalization is going to happen very quickly without the need for Congress to be involved, and it is going to snap its gold all over the world in areas where the US has jurisdiction. And if all that gold comes back, then the United States can use that gold to sort of start a new currency and have various options. But that's essentially the risk. And you can see that all these tariffs are making US nationalization more likely.
Yeah, and I think that's, as you mentioned, one of the reasons why Gregor Silver Bullion have chosen Singapore only, because this avoids the other jurisdictional risks, and along with that becomes other things like testing. We make sure things are tested here, the insurance that we offer here. But besides those, getting back to ownership, I think, this is a topic that sometimes can be unclear, because people buy gold and they think they own it, but do they truly own it? And you have your own thoughts on this, and you have your own methodology to it.
We spent 15 years understanding gold industry in a way. It's a gold vaulting industry. And I used to work on a structured product desk with quants before building derivatives. So the financial risk assessment, counterparty risk, that's sort of in my blood. And after 2008, and I moved into gold vaulting, right? I just saw it from a very different perspective. We didn't happen to be in the gold business. We moved into the gold business because we want to create systemic wealth protection for our clients. We want to prepare for a scenario like that. And that's where we realized a few things. The first one was, as we mentioned earlier, you have to, gold is something physical, which means it has to be stored somewhere, which means it has to be under somebody's jurisdiction. Singapore, we believe, is the best place worldwide for this, for various reasons. The next point is, who's standing between you and the gold?
Yes.
Because the more companies you have in between, the more things can go wrong. And there's a contract between each company. How much do you know about this contract? And who do these companies need to be subject to? Are they subject to the United States or not, for example, or to some other country? And so you create a very complex set of counterparty and jurisdictional risks that you should be aware of. Most people are not. They don't think of it this way. But essentially, the more entities you have in between, the less safe your gold is when these sort of things happen. The next question, as you alluded, is there any gold? Because oftentimes there really isn't. And is it legal or is it illegal? Well, it's legal because most people don't know what they're buying. When you look at a lot of these products out there, what people really have is price exposure to gold.
Right.
And people assume there's actual gold behind it when there isn't. In some cases, they have unallocated gold, which means if there should be 100 kilos worth of gold, people believe, there might only be 1 kilo. And remember, when the way banks work on a fractional reserve banking system, whereby if you're putting $100 in the bank, there's only $10 which is actually held in reserve or to cover deposits. The other $90 are used by the bank as they see fit. So that money might not be there for backing. And banks and financial institutions tend to look at gold the same way as they look at US dollars or something else. Why should they have to keep 100%? I keep 10%, that should be plenty. And if people have the impression that all the money should be there, well, that's their problem. People also have the impression that all the money I deposit in a bank is there, right? That's their problem if they don't understand how the system works. And so if you want to make sure your gold is there, you have to put a lot more work into. There are a few things which are easy indicators for you to know whether there really is gold or not. Most importantly, if you just have a balance telling you you have 512 ounces of silver, or you have 2.725 ounces of gold, it's quite questionable what you have, because you should really have a list of actual bars with a specific serial number that identifies you as the owner of that portion. If you have that, then most likely you have some form of ownership on that item. Now, there are two different types of ownership, legal and beneficial, which is something we can come in later. But that's something which would really mean you have a claim on these items. If you just have a balance, it becomes very questionable what you have, and what's going to happen to it in case of a nationalization. And usually you cannot find out. At best, you can read the small print in the documents to get you a rough idea, but you will then be confused by certain industry practices. For example, when it comes to insurance, you will probably be told that if there is gold, it is covered by an all-risk insurance. And people will think that means all risk covered. But it's just a technical term, which really means all risk included unless excluded. And so you would need to know what are the exclusions. And the most important exclusions we often talk about is mysterious disappearance, right. Which is a catch-all, which you should really try to have there if you want to store gold with somebody. But the people you'll be talking to, they would have probably no clue about this, even at the companies. That's really going into the nitty-gritty details. And so you have all of these layers and this complexity. And when you add it all up, there is a saying in the industry, if you can touch it, you don't own it. Yeah. And there's a surprising amount of wisdom there, because oftentimes that's very true. And I think what we've been working for the last 15 years is to make sure that if we store gold, it truly is yours, even if you cannot touch it. You can touch it if you come here, but why don't you keep it at home? And so there's definitely a big point to be made that you should probably be keeping a bit of gold and silver at home. But there's also the reality that if you look at a nationalization like in 1933, there was a 10-year prison sentence if you didn't turn in your gold. Basically, gold became like cocaine. And so you basically will be dealing with contraband. And it still might make sense to have some gold on you. If you have a larger amount, it also makes sense to store some of that wealth in a jurisdiction where it's not going to become contraband, where gold remains a safe haven asset for long-term intergenerational storage. And you have a wealth of options on which country to store it. And we believe Singapore is one of the best places. Some people say, well, it's so far away. But that's a plus and a minus. It depends how you see it. And I think as you hedge your international risk or your systemic risk of things going bad, it's not always a bad idea to put a bit of gold on the other side of the world, especially if you do your due diligence and understand why something is kept safely for you.
Right. I've often heard people say, keep some gold, let's say gold in arm's reach, in car's reach, and out of reach. And this is exactly what we're talking about, where it's not just diversification of assets, but also the location of your assets. And with that, people who do diversify and store it with you here at Silver Bullion, they also have the opportunity to come down and have a personal audit. They can come down and even look at their gold and silver. But what are typically their expressions, their emotion when they can actually be able to go into a vault and see how their things are being kept and see that it's legitimately real through testing?
Well, we have done a lot of things different from the way the industry works.
Right.
The industry has been very traditional, there have been very little innovation, and it's mostly runs on secrecy. Vaults of the scales that we have built here, they're normally not accessible. And you might be storing $200 million worth of gold, but you're not allowed to go see your gold. And you're being told because of security. Well, we designed this building in a way so that we can have both accessibility and have security. And we have had quite a bit of interaction with species inspectors from Lloyd's of London, for insurance to basically make all of this work. But our basic concept is you create transparency.
Right.
Because I would argue the risk of somebody coming in with an armed sort of commando trying to steal something, going through the 9 doors and all the other stuff that there is, it's really minuscule. But the risk of a company finding shortcuts or not having the gold there which you think should be there, it's much, much higher. And in software development we have a saying that security through obscurity doesn't work. And it is causing for black boxes usually tend to stop working well after a while. Meaning that if you have a system where you don't know what's going on, you can assume that after decades things are going to work less and less well. Mm-hmm. Some things might get lost, maybe it's not so good. So we wanted to create a system which will work well over a long period of time. And the way you do that is you make it transparent. You protect your clients from yourself. We build a system so that our clients can see if we do something wrong. And because of that, we have to be on our toes to make sure everything works. And one of the key parts of that is that a client has to be able to come to the vault and has to be able to demand that he's going to see the 5 bars that we have. And out of the 60,000 bars that we have to know exactly where each bar is at any point in time, because if we don't, you're going to be spending 3 days trying to find that bar. And that takes quite a bit of IT systems, compliance processes and so on in place. But we've been building these from the beginning, and that's why if somebody wants to do a custom audit, in addition to, say, quarterly audits that we're doing, they're welcome to do so. You give us a day or two notice, we kind of schedule it, and either the client or a representative of the client can come and can demand to see the actual bars which are his or her property. I think that's a very important thing that a world ought to be able to do in order to show that the goals are really kept.
Right. I just want to get back to Singapore. How does it expertly maintain its neutrality with everything going on in the world? Because people are looking for that safe place, and Singapore's way of having that neutrality is delivering a safe place. How are they able to do it?
Well, the Prime Minister just made a comment about that, actually.
Oh, he did?
Well, he was essentially saying that everybody is telling us that, they're happy for Singapore to be neutral, but then, both China and the US are asking for, can you do this and can you do that, and,
Yeah.
So, and what they essentially said is, Singapore just sort of does whatever's in the best interest of Singapore. Mm-hmm. And we are transparent about it, and we will explain why we are making a decision based on the best interest of Singapore, and why that decision is not being made on the behalf of the United States or on the behalf of China. Mm-hmm. And Singapore's interest is to remain neutral. And that's essentially how Singapore navigates around it, and sort of finds that happy medium.
Right. So this is something. It's from top down, left to right. This importance of neutrality. It's not just a certain element of government. It's the whole entirety of government.
Oh yes. Because at the end of the day, Singapore has been hosting a number of high-profile mediation, right? Like. Mm-hmm. Trump ended up meeting North Korea here in Singapore, and other things like that. It's the world always needs a common ground area, whether that's Switzerland, whether that's Singapore. You look at World War II, right? Nobody really attacked Switzerland because you needed that sort of entity, and it was a neutral country. And it helps when you're well defended. Right? I mean, right. Switzerland is on these mountains, and it's like a porcupine.
Right.
Singapore is not on mountains, but is also very well defended. As a matter of fact, I believe Singapore is the most highly militarized country in the world. If you take the defense budget of around $16 billion US, and the size of Singapore is around 720 kilometers or something, then you end up with an average spending of close to $20 million per square kilometer. You compare that to the United States, which of course has a much bigger military, but a lot more territory to defend. Right. And you look at around $61,000. So on a per square kilometer basis, Singapore is investing in something like 250 times more in its military. And it's a well-defended country in ASEAN, and it probably has one of the most powerful militaries, in its area, even though it's just a small city-state. And politicians here have been quite forthcoming, saying that, it's important to be well-defended, so that when other countries tell you to jump, you can ask, why should I jump? Yeah. And not have to ask, how high should I jump? And that's all part of being able to be a neutral country. And relevance, that's another very important thing. Are you relevant? If Taiwan wouldn't have all these semiconductor manufacturing entities, I don't think the United States will care much about Taiwan, to be honest. It's those semiconductor manufacturing industries which make Taiwan relevant. Right. And Singapore is the second largest port in the world. It is one of the largest refineries in the world. Most people are not aware of that. Saudi Arabia refines about 3 million barrels of oil per day. Singapore does 1.5 million. So half of Saudi Arabia's refinery capacity is coming from Singapore. And most of Australia, from my understanding, has oil refined in Singapore, for example. So Singapore is relevant in so many ways. It produces 10% of all semiconductors worldwide. Over 20% of semiconductor manufacturing equipment is coming out of Singapore. Pharmaceuticals, of course, the finance industry. There's so many things happening here. And it is this sort of neutral, trusted entity, and it will remain that. I mean, politicians, are very well aware of that. That Singapore needs to remain that bridge between East and West.
Right. Yeah, I think the other things that the politicians really got right was the debt, because there is a misconception that Singapore is in debt, but in reality, it's one of the few nations that are not.
Yeah, well, say gets the numbers from the IMF, I believe.
Okay.
And so if you look at the IMF, you will find that Singapore is listed as having a very high amount of debt,
Right.
Cross debt. And the devil is in the details, because in reality, if you look at net debts, you look at the assets Singapore has and you look at the debt, then you will find that Singapore has close to 100% of assets surplus. So we are close to 100% in net asset. As a matter of fact, every year the assets of Singapore are producing about 3.5% of GDP in return, in which the government then gets to essentially spend. So Singapore is not paying interest on debt, it is receiving investment returns on its assets, which are being invested through Temasek, GIC, and the MAS. Essentially, 2 of the top 10 sovereign wealth funds in the world are Singaporean. And so, where is the debt coming from? Well, it's an accounting matter. And the way it works is, if you pay into the Singapore pension system, which is fully funded, it's not like Social Security, which is unfunded, then the government borrows the money you put into the pension system in order to put that money into the sovereign wealth funds to create the investments and the returns to help cover the pension system and create more money for people put in the pension system. Well, the IMF considers that to be debt. But what it is a transfer from the savings of the pension systems to the sovereign wealth fund system to invest it. It's very different from the way debt is usually defined, which is a country spending more than it receives in income, having budget deficits, and then having the debt becoming higher and higher. So if you net out these things, you will find that Singapore is one of the wealthiest countries in the world by far. And you don't have to take my word for this. I mean, you can just go to the country reviews by the big global debt rating agencies, and you will see that Singapore has the highest rating everywhere. It is just a misconception which was just being created by taking these numbers out of context.
Right. Well, I'm already in Singapore, and after hearing all this, I want to go to Singapore. But the world, I mean, where we are right now, if you had a risk meter, are we headed towards more risk the way things are going right now?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, we have an established order. We have a Pax Americana, basically, right? A US-based sort of standard way of doing things, and that is slowly breaking down. And it happened throughout history. I mean, roughly every 80 to 100 years, we have a switch in reserve currencies. Right. In the 18th century, France was the one having the reserve currency, Napoleon and so on. And then it all changed with the Battle of Waterloo. I mean, it doesn't change overnight, it's a gradual sort of decline, but there was a war between France and England. The Battle of Waterloo was won by England, and that is widely seen as, the turning point when England really became the world dominating power, and the British pound became the reserve currency. And then in the earlier 20th century, we had that switch where the US dollar became the reserve currency. Why? Well, US dollar had the strongest economy. It ended up with the strongest military at the end of World War II. By 1945, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement, which made it official that the US dollar is the reserve currency, backed by gold. And that switch between the UK and the US was a gradual, peaceful one. The US dollar was just too dominating, there was no question about it. But now we are in a very different situation because the US dollar definitely is having a lot of issues, but there's not a very clear alternative. The Chinese yuan is this restricted currency. China also has problems. The euro is a mess. The Japanese yen doesn't make any sense. Where do you put your assets in? And so we are heading towards a time when there's going to be more and more uncertainty. And I think the role of gold, is going to play a more important role, and eventually silver. And then of course everybody's talking about Bitcoin and so on. And there's value in what Bitcoin is, or you can transfer funds behind it. But I don't see Bitcoin as being a basis for transaction of countries. Just look at it this way. If China is going through all of these efforts to accumulate more gold, what does China want to trade its goods for in the future? It's not going to be Bitcoin. They banned Bitcoin. It's going to be gold. And if you want to buy goods from the Chinese, you're going to be much better off trying to get something from them for gold than for Bitcoin. Now, whether in the West people are going to, be able to get gold in exchange for Bitcoin and so on, that's every market is going to be different, and people can still make a lot of money with Bitcoin. But from a geopolitical point of view, Bitcoin is not going to be the currency of exchange between nations. That's going to remain gold.
Yeah, that's a good point because you brought up Bretton Woods, how the dollar was partially backed by gold. Then we know in 71 the gold window closed, and then in 74 we had the dollar being backed by oil with the petrodollar, so to say. And now with the petrodollar essentially dying off, and the US dollar is really having a difficult time, let's just say. What then backs the US dollar at this point? If it's not gold anymore, it's not oil anymore, what is it? Because I think the world hopes it's not going to be threats, it's not going to be war, they're looking for some peaceful type of a currency, let's say.
The US dollar's value is its ability to repay its debts, which then depends on whether people trust the US will be able to repay its debts.
Right.
The more debt you accumulate and the more you monetize the currency, but you basically print more currency to fund more debt. And you go into a spiral where it's getting worse and worse and worse because the more debt you create, the more interest you have to pay, which means you have to print more money to pay the interest. Once that goes out of whack, then basically the US dollar is living only on inertia. Yeah. I've always used US dollars, I'll keep on using US dollars. But then if my neighbor stops using it and he's got an alternative, maybe I should start doing this other thing. And Bitcoin is gaining a bit based on this, right?
Yeah.
People are buying Bitcoin partially because it's an alternative to the US dollar, and they see it as such. But there are going to be many other sort of entities, and what I expect is that when a country is going to face a currency crisis where people are truly moving away from the dollar, throughout history, countries have started banning everything else. So that's where gold gets nationalized, like in 1933. You can be sure that Bitcoin is going to get banned. And whatever alternative is going to be banned. In the UK, at one point, it was a matter of treason to use anything but the British pound for settlement of debt. And treason is a strong word.
Yes, it is.
So it's a pattern. And if you look at Ray Dalio, who wrote a lot about these things, and is probably the most knowledgeable person in the world about these matters, and who's proven himself by being the most successful investor, hedge fund manager worldwide, right? He's showing how there's really 6 phases of a country's rise and eventual decline of big powers. In each phase is seeding the seeds for the next phase. In other words, a country starts, you build up the industry, you become powerful, and eventually you start spending more than you produce, and you start having debt.
Right.
And a bit of that debt is actually a good thing because you can use it for investment purposes and become more powerful. Mm-hmm. But at some point, a lot of that debt just becomes for consumption. And then that debt starts growing. And then I think a turning point happens when politicians start saying that they no longer worry about debt, when they think it's their right to print money no matter what. And we had that happening with Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney under President Bush, the young one, right, mentioned that deficits don't matter anymore. And when politicians feel that they can say that publicly, then you know that something has gone terribly wrong with the political system, and that you'll just have a runaway fiscal debt, spiking like this. And that was 20 years ago almost?
Yeah, it's been a while, yes.
And look what happened with the debt. Exactly these things are happening.
Right.
So we are in what Ray Dalio calls phase 5, which is essentially this runaway debt time. And there are 3 things that define, key things that define a phase 5. You have unsustainable fiscal deficits,
yes,
and debt. You have internal conflicts, which we're definitely having in the United States, right? Like never before. And you have geopolitical tensions. And
right,
they all come in together. And we have all of 3 of these things. So this happens throughout history over and over and over, and it's happening now. And that's how phase 5 is setting the stage for phase 6. And phase 6 is the reset. And that reset can be peaceful, the way it went from the UK to the US. It can be war, the way it went from France into to the UK, or it can be something in between. And we're probably looking at something in between. And I think one of the most likely scenarios now is not that we're going to have a hot war between the US and China, at least I hope.
Yeah, I hope also.
But a financial war, the currency war scenario I explained, that is becoming more and more likely the way things are going. And I think as a person, you would want to make sure you're aware of that and start looking at these things from a perspective outside the United States and see at how you can protect yourself long term from these things. Me having lived in the United States for about 12 years, having lived in Europe for about 15 years, now being here in Asia, I got to see the differences, and I live these differences, and that's why they're very present to me. And I try to summarize what I learned. Mm-hmm. And I hope people would be interested enough to learn about these, because they will certainly affect you down the line.
Yeah, I think the interesting part here is you mentioned the word reset, and I won't go too deep into it, but currencies, they often start out as having some type of a gold backing. And now we're at a time where a major currency may be dying, and we're looking at some type of a gold backing for wealth protection. So it almost folds right into these things we're looking at and talking about, whereas a currency may die, you need that wealth protection, being gold, silver, precious metals. And as a currency starts, let's say the BRICS, it starts off with a gold backing. So is there any reason not to move into gold or silver right now?
Physical gold. It
Yes.
makes a lot of sense to do this because I think, as I mentioned earlier, if a tree falls in a forest, did it really fall if nobody saw it? Right? That's a bit what's happening with gold, because the way the gold price and the silver price especially is determined is in future markets.
Mm-hmm.
In the United States, it will be traded in COMEX, for example. But gold is a physical asset, and it can be sold and traded outside of COMEX. And so a lot of gold is traded outside of COMEX, usually using the prices set at COMEX, but that demand is not reflected in COMEX. And so all this gold which is flowing into China and other countries, it's not showing up in the buy and sell pricing of things. And so in many ways, while gold has been reaching new highs over and over, I think gold is greatly undervalued, really. And undervalued in what terms? Well, it depends what you're measuring it in. The US dollar is gold is usually measured in US dollars. So you should look at how many US dollars are being created relative to gold. That seems like a fair assumption. Mm-hmm. And if we were to take the amount of US debt being created, and you look at how much gold the United States says they own, which is around 8,000 plus tons of gold, and you take the current value of around 2,600 US dollars per ounce, then you will find, based on the official federal debt, that's about 2% backing compared to the debt. So if you were to assume, for example, said, if we make a new currency, the new currency is going to have to be fully backed by gold, which is a questionable assumption, but let's say it is. And let's say that existing debts will have to be covered by this new currency. So what should the price of gold be? Remember, you always have enough gold. It's just a matter of how expensive is the gold.
Correct.
So you take your 8,000 or 8,500 tons and you compare it to the debt of, say, 36 trillion. And at current prices, you only have 2% backing. So you're going to have to increase the price of gold in US dollar terms by 50 times in order to make it work. We take $2,600 times 50. We have $130,000 per ounce. Well, I'm not saying it's going to. I'm not saying it's going to go that high overnight. But the way the US dollar is being printed, it can easily explode upwards if trust in the US dollars is lost. At some point, it really doesn't matter how much is being printed. And we have an example of the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. Most of the issue was created during World War I and the years before, and then it took 6-7 years really for the trust to be lost. And that's when it hyperinflated. Right. So a currency doesn't hyperinflate if you create more money. It hyperinflates when people lose trust. And they usually lose trust because too much money was being created and was debased too much. So it becomes a psychological question. When is that going to happen? And if that's going to happen, you don't want to be holding US dollars. Yeah. And that's when the nationalization is going to happen, because that's when the government knows it needs the gold. And it's going to take the gold, and it's going to say, I'm not stealing it from you, I'm giving the US dollars in payment. But the very reasons they have to do that is because the US dollar is going down the drain. Right? So is gold undervalued? Yeah. But can it go down by 10% in the next 2 weeks? Sure. Right? We are not talking about what's going to happen in the next week, what's going to happen next month. We're looking at broad systemic changes. And you can be sure that the people who own physical gold, because if you own paper gold, you have too much counterparty risk, so it probably won't be worth anything. Then you're going to be part of that winning side where a lot of that wealth transfers that's going to happen is going to come towards you. And if you're a gold bug, you probably heard that story for many years. But these things take time. Empires don't die overnight. Well, things might happen quickly at some point, but it just pays to have a backup in gold, no matter what.
Right. In the we're talking about gold as how it's going to have a monetary role in the future. I mean, it surely looks that way. Silver, do we see a monetary future for silver, or more industrial, a bit of a dual type of a role?
Russia now added silver as a reserve asset together with gold. So Russia is of the opinion that silver should have monetary value. I don't really know, but silver is so greatly undervalued, and it's in so much industrial needs that even without its monetary value, it definitely makes a lot of sense to purchase silver. And throughout history, it was silver that was the key monetary metal.
Yes.
The US dollar was not based on gold originally, it was based on silver. Then later it became a bimetallic standard. China was invaded by England and other European powers because there was an imbalance of silver. The Chinese were not willing to give up the silvers in trade, and eventually it caused the invasion of China by the West. Right? So silver was a very important sort of metal. Will it return to this? Maybe, maybe not. But if gold is going to go up so high, silver will also go up. And a lot of people which are looking at gold and saying, hey, I should have invested in gold earlier, are going to look at silver and say, oh, gold is making new highs all the time. Silver is still 40% below its all-time high.
Yes.
I should probably buy a bit of silver. And silver is 200 times smaller as a market compared to gold. So it doesn't take a lot of money flowing into silver to really push it up. And the physical reserves of silver are being exhausted, literally. So most of my money is not in gold. My money is mostly in silver.
Right. I think you're one of the few people I know that actually, when they talk about silver, they are really invested in silver. One more metal though, platinum. I mean, platinum is I believe less than half the price of gold right now, and at one time it was even more than the price of gold. How do you feel about platinum? What's your thoughts on platinum?
Yeah, I mean, platinum class is always higher than gold class, right? In airplanes and
I'm stuck
memberships
in
and other things like that. So my understanding is platinum is a lot rarer than gold. I'm a bit perplexed why platinum has been falling so much compared to gold. I know there are production problems in South Africa, and there's probably less platinum coming up. So I know several people in the mining industry, which knows the mining industry really well, and they like to buy a lot of platinum. So I do have a little bit of platinum, and I think there's not a lot of things you can go wrong. I can also tell you it's the physical supply of platinum is very little. It's a lot less than silver. I don't think you can do anything wrong by owning some platinum.